Okay, so we're gonna jump into maple cream now. Um, this is one of the value added products that you can make with your maple syrup. Um, when we go to the local farmers market, if you go to the local farmers market and you're just, say, for example, taking syrup, sales can be a little slow. Okay, so I'll give you an example. When I go to the farmers market with our family on a Saturday morning, we have maple cream, we have maple candy, we have hard maple candy, we have maple root beer, maple mustard, maple syrup, maple cotton candy. We have a wide variety of products. Okay, the more products or the more variety of products that you have at your booth, the easier it is to differentiate yourself from another producer. Okay, so I mean, if you really want to try and capitalize on as many sales as you can at your local market, the more products that you can take, the better off you are. And when we start talking about value added products, this is a great way to get more money for your product or for your syrup. Okay, so today specifically, we're going to talk about maple cream. I'm probably going to turn the lights on and off a couple different times throughout this process. We're going to run a batch of cream through the cream machine and give everybody a sample of what it tastes like, and you'll get a little bit better indication of how this whole process works. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is invert sugar. Okay, if you're making any maple convection, invert sugar is really one of the things that can be the determining factor between success and failure. Okay, so what are invert sugars? So if I drill a tap hole into that maple tree, I pull that drill bit out. If I took a syringe, I could go inside that tap hole and I could extract sterile sucrose. Okay, sucrose is a 12 carbon sugar, and that is the majority of the sugar that we are going to extract from that tree. It's going to be that sucrose, which is that 12 atom or that 12 carbon sugar. Okay, so when we look at sucrose, it is converted to invert sugars in a variety of different ways. Okay, we go through some microbial fermentation, heat. The dirtier our equipment gets, the higher our air temperatures get, the higher our microbial contamination get, our invert sugar levels elevate. Okay, so what is happening? Okay, so what happens basically is that 12 carbon sugar is getting broken apart into two 6 carbon sugars. Okay, so we are going to get broke into glucose and fructose. Okay, so when we talk about invert sugars, we're going to talk about that sucrose, that split into those two 6 carbon sugars, glucose and fructose. Okay, with that being said, generally lighter syrups have a lower invert sugar level. Okay, however, with RO technology, like say I've got a gas evaporator, I've got air injection, we've got a nice automatic draw off, I got an RO that can concentrate to 22 to 25 bricks. I can take some really crummy late season syrup and I can make a nice light syrup out of it. It doesn't really match the conditions it was made in, but with the technology that's in my equipment, I can process it that way. Okay, so the best rule of thumb, if you're not going to test your syrup, is syrup that was usually made early in the season. So what do we know about early season syrup? Our equipment is generally the cleanest. The temperatures are usually the lowest. So my microbial levels are low and my invert sugar levels are usually low. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to measure the invert sugar level of our syrup, and we can use that or make that measurement with a blood glucose meter. Okay? So syrup is too thick to be tested by using just a straight glucose meter, so we need to dilute it. Okay? The dilution rate that we're going to use for this is we're going to use 10 grams of maple syrup, 90 grams of water. We're going to stir this aggressively, and we're going to make a solution that is readable with that blood glucose meter. Okay? Like I mentioned, 10 grams of syrup, 90 grams of water. And then basically what I can do is I can read that material. It'll be thin enough that I can read it with that glucose meter. Now, I have a little kitchen scale up here. We need a very accurate small scale that can read in 1/10 of a gram increments, okay? We need to make sure this measurement is done quite precisely and that we're getting the right amount of syrup and we're getting the right amount of water, and it's going to be done by weight, like I say, on that small gram scale. Okay, so there are many different meters that you can buy, okay? The meter that you want to buy to measure this correctly is a meter that is going to measure milligram or milliliters. Hold on here, I got to stop it. I'm going to get it on the next slide. Bear with me. We are going to need a meter that reads milligrams in deciliters, okay? Now, there are different blood glucose meters out there on the market. Some of them are simply going to read high or low depending on the sugar that it comes in contact with. And if you buy a meter that measures glucose in blood plasma, those are usually going to read 10 to 15% higher, okay? So if you go to Walgreens, say for example, you're going to look for, and I'll turn the light on for you this so you can see this real quick. They're pretty simple and straightforward. These are the little meters you're going to look for. This is going to measure that milligrams and deciliters. It's just a small blood glucose meter. This particular meter uses a test strip. So what you'll do is you'll put the test strip in the bottom of the meter, and then that'll activate the meter, turn the meter on, and then you put that into your solution, and then you record the reading that you're going to get on that glucose meter. So that really kind of is how that process is going to work. So when we look at levels of invert sugar, we really want an acceptable level of invert sugar to make cream is going to be 0.5% up to 4%. Okay, that is going to be, where we're going to see success in making our maple cream. If we start to exceed 4%, we're going to struggle. Okay, so what do we know about glucose and fructose? Those are the two 6-carbon sugars. When those split, they retain moisture. Okay, sucrose is very simple. It's like table sugar. We can dry it out. It's easy to work with. But when we look at that, once it's split into glucose and fructose, those two sugars retain a lot of moisture. If we can't get that moisture out of there, we're going to make a cream that wants to separate and is going to have a little bit of a grainy flavor or a sandy taste to it. It's going to be fine. You're just going to have a problem with your crystallization in the process, okay? So 1.5% would be ideal. I checked this syrup at the sugar house before I brought it over. This material here is about 1.4 on the invert sugar level. This barrel of syrup that this came out of was like my 4th or 5th barrel. I think it was barrel number 5. I produced that barrel of syrup on roughly March 6th of last spring. So it was very early in the season. I think our first boil was like the 2nd or 3rd of March at our place. So, like I say, it was a very early season syrup, very light, very low invert, which is what we're looking for. Now, when we look at the invert sugar levels, it really affects our process temperature. Like I had mentioned before, glucose and fructose don't like to give up moisture. So when we look at that, here's my blood glucose meter reading. It read about 70. I'm over here at 1.4. But when we look at our percent of invert, once our invert sugar climbs from over 1%, 2%, 3%, what happens? I start to have to elevate my processing temperature. I got to cook that syrup a little bit hotter to get rid of that additional moisture that's being held by that glucose and fructose or that invert sugar, okay? So now we're going to talk a little bit about maple cream. Okay. So 1 gallon of 66 bricks maple syrup will yield 8.58 pounds of 88 bricks maple cream, or about 137 ounces. The average price of maple cream is about $1.15 per ounce. When you make your syrup into maple cream, you can get about $157 a gallon. for your syrup, okay, which isn't bad, okay. The best money maker in a value-added product is maple cotton candy. Between $500 and $600 a gallon you get for your syrup when you make it into candy, cotton candy, I should say. But this is one of those products, like I say, that you can increase the revenue, that you get for your maple syrup. So syrup selection, sugar invert, usually 1.4 to 1.6 would be ideal. Like say we can go as low as 0.5, we can go as high as 4. If we are pushing up on the invert level percentage, closer to 3 or 4, we are going to have to increase that process temperature to make sure that we are getting that water removed from that syrup prior to running it through the cream machine. Okay. The lower the invert, the better the cream will be. Okay. So what is the enemy of making maple cream? It is the sugar and the fact that it wants to kind of start to crystallize. Okay. If my syrup isn't cooled correctly, it's going to want to crystallize. If my invert is off, it's going to want to crystallize. And then when I run it through the machine, even though I ran it through the machine, I'm going to pick up that sandy or that gritty flavor to that maple cream. Maple cream should be nice and smooth. There shouldn't be no grittiness or anything to it. So, all right. So I'm going to turn the lights on for this part because we're going to run through a bunch of stuff. So all those charts and all the stuff that I'm talking about with sugar invert, does anybody have the North American Maple Syrup Manual? Does anybody have that? Okay. I have one. I use it all the time. Okay. If you don't have the North American Maple Syrup Manual, like these charts here, this information, these are all screenshot right out of the North American Manual. Okay. If you want this manual, you can get it for free. You can go to www.mapleresearch.org and you can download the 3rd edition of the North American Maple Syrup Producer's Manual for free. It's a big download. It's 434 pages. Okay. So you can also buy it in a spiral bound copy. We might have them here at Ross. I know we sell them through our Wisconsin Maple Syrup Producers Association. I think that spiral bound copy is around $55 or $60. It is a very good reference. All of this information regarding invert sugars in every value-added product that we make out of maple syrup is going to have a different rating for sugar invert. So if I'm going to make hard candy, if I'm going to make soft molded candy, if I'm going to make granulated maple sugar, it all has a little bit of different invert levels, and it'll show you exactly where you're going to be successful. Okay. Okay, so CDL has a really good website, and if you go on CDL's website, there's a how-to tab, okay? So when it comes to making maple taffy, maple sugar, maple cream, sugar on snow, whatever the case may be, if you go on to their website, click on the how-to tab, it will come up with these really nice, clear and concise, step-by-step instructions. Okay, as crazy as it may sound, they're detailed to the point where it'll tell you when you need to cut the heat on the stove in half so you don't boil it over. And it'll tell you once you get over this temperature, you can turn the heat up so that you can cook it faster. I mean, they've got some really clear, concise directions. Okay, so with that being said, we need to talk about how we cool our maple cream. Okay, so this particular kettle has our cream in that we boiled yesterday. Our syrup level is about right up to here. So we want to cool that in a water bath for about 4 hours after we get it boiled. Okay. And what we want to do is if we cool it correctly, we will not generate any sugar crystals. Okay. So what did I mention before about sugar crystals? It gives that grainy appearance. It also makes our maple cream want to separate. Okay. It's going to want to try and go back to syrup. Okay, so that's another reason why we need to get it cooled correctly. So we submerge this kettle in kind of this drainer pan, for lack of better terminology, above the syrup line. We put some cups in the bottom to keep the bottom surface of that pan off the bottom of that plastic tub. The reason we do that is we want to make sure that we have water circulating around that entire surface of that kettle so that we're cooling it evenly so that we don't develop the sugar crystals. Okay. When I take that off the heat, we're going to talk about why I spray the top of the syrup with cold water to avoid crystallization from coming in from the exposure to the air. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. But before you even get ready to make cream, you got to set up your cooling process. You got to have it set up so that you can get it cooled correctly so that you're successful when it comes to pouring it through the machine. Okay. All right. We're going to talk about thermometers. Okay. If you sat through my first class, we talked a little bit about thermometers. So I use a 12-inch bimetal dial thermometer to make my cream. Okay, it's a 0 to 50. Everything on CDL's website that you're going to look at is going to talk about temperatures 0 plus degrees, for lack of better terminology. So when you look at this particular recipe for making cream, it's going to say you take it off the heat at 21.5 degrees over the boiling point or over 0. Okay, so everything that we work with on this site is going to be based on a 0 to 50 thermometer. Good thermometer, bimetal, very accurate. What happened to the good thermometers that we had years ago? They had mercury in them. Okay, you could stick 6 of those in a kettle of boiling water and they would all boil at the same temperature. Okay, thermometers, if I grab 6 thermometers off the store shelf today, they're all going to boil at different temperatures. Okay, boil that thermometer at your location on the day you're going to make your cream. Set your 0, stem half submerged in boiling water, set the boiling point to 0, okay? Leave it in there for a few minutes, make sure it's got a good rolling boil, make sure we calibrate it, okay? What changes our boiling point? Elevation above sea level and atmospheric pressure. That's the 2 factors that affect our boiling point. So every day the boiling point's going to be a little different. If you follow this one simple thing when making any maple convections, your odds of being successful are probably at least 90%. Okay, so many people say, well, I cook my syrup to 265. That's 265 on their thermometer. Okay, this thermometer is going to be different than yours. It's going to be different than Todd's. It's going to be different than everybody's. Okay, there are no 2 thermometers the same. Start out, get it boiled in water, get the 0 set, and like I say, you will be successful. Okay, so for this particular example, we used a 1.25 gallons of maple syrup. We put it into this kettle. For this particular kettle, we used a tablespoon of dry defoamer. Okay, so we added that to the syrup before we started the boiling process to keep the boil down. You know, so what do we know about syrup? Syrup finishes at 219, okay, or 7 degrees over the boiling point of water. We're cooking this cream to 21.5 degrees over the boiling point, so we're going a lot higher. Syrup has a tendency to foam a little bit more, so we use a dry defoamer. So CDL does have, or does make mention in this recipe on their website, that you can take a stick of butter and go around the inside of your kettle. And as the syrup boils up, it'll hit the butter and take it down. We don't necessarily want to follow that practice because of food allergens. Okay, we want to make sure that we're using an approved defoamer like the dry defoamer that we have there in that container, and that we're not putting any other foods in our maple syrup, especially an allergen. So kind of keep that in mind. If it's something you're going to do for yourself and you're going to use all the cream yourself, you can knock yourself out. You can make it however you'd like. But the minute that you want to give it to a neighbor for a Christmas gift, like I say, we got to be mindful of food allergies. All right. So with that being said, we're gonna, it'll go like say right through here. It'll tell you, when to turn the temperature up, when to cut the temperature in half. It'll go through the whole boiling process. Like I had mentioned, the syrup will be ready when it's 22 over the boiling point. Okay. Now I mentioned before that we take it off at 21.5. So my stove is here in the kitchen here. My water bath is right over here. So I take it off here at 21.5. By the time I walk over here, I set it in the water bath. It made it up to 22. Okay, it's that quick. Now, if I go right to 22 on the stove and I go over to there, I might be 22.5 to 23 by the time I hit the water bath. So like I say, we got to be mindful that the higher that we cook, and cream is a lower temperature, when we start making hard molded candy or sugar, we start cooking up at 42 and 50 degrees over the boiling point. When the water is just about boiled out of our syrup, it goes really fast. It gets hot really quick. So you got to be really mindful of how fast that temperature climbs when we get on the tail end of this here. So, okay, like I mentioned before, we took it off at at 21 and a half over. We set it in the water. I removed my thermometer. I have a little spray bottle of cold water. And what I did is I came over, there was no foil on it, and I sprayed the surface of that boiled syrup with that cold water. So what I do by doing that is when I spray it on there, it immediately steams off. So I'm not changing the bricks at all. But by spraying that water on the surface, I kind of create a skin on top of that maple syrup that doesn't let the air or the oxygen penetrate. If the air doesn't penetrate that skin on top of that syrup, I will not grow sugar crystals. Okay, and that really is the key. And you're going to be able to see here in a few minutes how I did here. So, okay, with that being said, we're going to start to run it through the cream machine. I'm going to try and find Samara to help me here. She's usually back here by now, so she might have got tied up with somebody. So what we're going to do is we're going to pour it in the machine. So I took it out of the water bath this morning. So it's been sitting here at room temperature. If you're going to run it right away and you take it out of the water bath, it doesn't hurt to put it in a pan of some 60 or 70 degree water to warm that volume up. So that's just a little bit thinner to go through that machine. So what we're going to do is we're going to pour it in. You can see that it's pretty thick based on how it pours. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of scoop some stuff off the bottom here. I'm going to see how good I did on my cooling process. See how it looks nice and crystal clear, almost like caramel. There's no sugar crystals in there. Okay. So I know that I did a pretty good job of cooling that syrup down so that I shouldn't have any sugar crystals in the process. Unfortunately, it's pretty thick. So one of the things that we do at our place is we go through and I hate cleaning this machine. So I usually end up making 3 or 4 batches of cream at a time. So we'll boil 3 or 4 kettles at one time. And then when I get the first batch through the machine, I'll just start it up and start the next batch. Because like I say, it's just as much work to clean the machine if you made 1 batch or if you made 3 or 4. So like I say, I hate cleaning it. So I make a couple batches at a time so I don't got to do it as often. So hang tight here. There you go. And then come on back. All right, so we're going to turn that on. Got my valve going the right way. I ran some on the floor the other day, so I was a little rusty. So, okay, so what's going to happen is, or what's going on inside this machine is there's a 3/4 horse electric motor in the bottom. There's a right angle gearbox, and there's a stainless steel gear pump. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of pour that, or we're going to put that syrup through that gear pump, and for lack of better terminology, it's going to kind of start to emulsify that syrup. The process takes a while, but it starts fairly quick. So when you look at, this is the stuff that we started with, okay? And then we're already starting to change color just a little bit, okay? So with that being said, Samara's going to kind of stir this as we go along here. We're going to talk a little bit more about cream and the different procedures. Okay, like I mentioned before, run multiple batches, okay? I had mentioned there's a gear pump in the bottom of this machine. That gear pump holds water, okay? We really have no way of draining the water out of that gear pump. So when I put that machine away, there's some water after the clean out. There's some water left in that gear pump. So now I want to start it up. It's been sitting for a while. I'll flush some water through the machine, and then what I'll do is I'll pour a little syrup into the gear pump to force any water out of there. Okay, I really don't want to pick up any water. I don't want to change my bricks. Okay, and that little bit of water that's left in that gear pump will change my bricks of that material that I'm pumping through there. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about packaging. Okay, maple cream can be packaged in glass or plastic. We're going to do glass today because that's what Dawn wanted to put in. I don't like packaging in glass because if you don't do it correctly and you have a few hiccups, it's going to show all your imperfections. So we're going to get graded today on how good of a job we did by what our cream looks like in the container. The other reason I don't use a lot of glass is I use plastic. And the reason that I use plastic is we put it in plastic containers and we freeze it right after we get it through the cream machine. Okay, maple cream has a kind of a short shelf life. Okay, and if I make a large batch of cream, I want to make sure it's as fresh as it can be. So like I say, we bring it in through the machine, into the containers, label it, we put it in the freezer, and then we actually sell it frozen at the farmer's market. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here kind of as we're going forward. We want containers with wide mouths. These particular bottles that we're going to use today have a 48 millimeter top, which is okay for this machine. It works pretty good. It was a little clumsy on the first day, but today's day number 3, so I'm getting a little more practice. So that's the container that we're going to use. When we look at the half-pound plastic cream tubs, the opening is probably closer to 3.5 inches. They're a little bit easier to fill. Okay. Now, care must be taken when we fill containers. Okay, we don't want air bubbles in our cream. If I have air bubbles in my cream, what's going to happen is the syrup that this is made out of, the syrup is going to want to travel toward that air pocket, and then you're going to see a little pocket of syrup will form inside that air pocket. Okay, so we want to make sure that when we're filling containers, we try to keep any air pockets out of them if we can. Okay. We talked about most of this. Okay, so if we talk about traditional maple cream, and that's what we're making today, is traditional maple cream. We're not using vacuum cooling. We're not using any products like invertase to adjust our enzymes in our syrup. So we're making a standard maple cream, and we're going to talk about its shelf life. Now, there are different ways of making maple cream, and like this is the standard way. Okay, so when we look at traditional maple cream, we have a shelf life of about a month if it's at room temperature. Okay, if we go into a refrigerator, we're going to have a shelf life of around 6 months. Okay, now let's talk about shelf life. Let's talk about processing. Why is our shelf life short on maple cream? It's a cold pack product. Okay, we're putting that cream through that machine or that syrup through that machine at 60, 65 degrees in there. We're not killing any microbial activity. Okay, anything that's floating around in the air, for lack of better terminology, is going to end up in your cream. So cleanliness at your facility is really kind of the key. So when we talk about cleanliness at our facility, we can see that it's running through the machine. Don't use a wooden spoon. Okay, these things are really dirty and they're full of microbial contamination. Okay, keep the wooden spoons out of manufacturing your cream. Okay, your shelf life on your cream is going to really be dictated by how clean your facility is and how clean your utensils are. Okay, if we have any type or sort or form of contamination, we're not, we don't have a high heat processing temperature with this. We don't kill any of it. So like I say, sanitation is really kind of the key. Okay. Like I mentioned, 6 months shelf life. If we refrigerate, like say we sell them frozen at the market, we tell the customers that they're frozen, just put them in the fridge to have them thaw and they're ready to go for consumption. All utensils, wash thoroughly, disinfected. If you are going to use a sanitizer, make sure that you are using a large hot water rinse to make sure that we don't have any sanitizer residue left any place. Okay. We need a clean environment. Okay. We usually do this in our kitchen, at our sugar house or our bottling room, which is, like I say, a very clean environment. So, like I say, the cleaner the environment, the better your shelf life, the more success you're going to have. I'm going to entertain a few questions here while we're kind of running through this. So I'm going to give you a little indication of what we're also looking for. So you can see right now it's kind of got like a shininess to it. Okay. We want to keep that running through the machine until it gets kind of more or less like a matte type finish, okay? You're going to see you'll see the cream inside of this tub. It'll go from that really glossy finish. It'll start getting that matte finish on it. And when it gets that matte finish on it, then it's time to start putting it in the containers, okay? Have you take that. Okay, so great. There's great stories that go with this. So the first time I took it to the farmer's market, I had and I don't want to pick on the ladies, but I had this gal come up to the table, and she's like, "Can I get some? I want to try it on my hands." It's not that kind of cream, okay? All right. So it's good on toast, it's good on bagels, it's good on waffles. My wife eats it by the spoonful out of the refrigerator, unfortunately, on me. But like I say, it's good on a lot of products. It's great with apple slices, and stuff like that. So this is one of the products, though, at the farmer's market you are going to want to sample. Okay, once you get people to sample the product, once they buy the product, we sampled it probably for like the first 2 years we took it to the farmer's market. After that, there was no need. Nope, I want some maple cream. They come into the booth, they grab it. Usually taster spoon. And please consult with, if you're taking it to your local farmer's market, please consult with your local market, and please abide by state rules for sampling of product. Okay, because that really is one of the keys too. When we sample product at the farmer's market, we have a list of things that we need to do to sample correctly to be in, how do I say it, to be within accordance with our license, with our manufacturing license. So, like I say, be mindful. Different states have different regulations. I can't tell you what works in Minnesota, probably won't work in Wisconsin. What works in Wisconsin probably won't work in Michigan. So, like I say, every state, and then when we drill down into certain cities and municipalities have different regs and different ways of sampling too, like our county fair is different than our farmers market. So, like I say, be mindful when you're doing sampling, but sampling is the key, yes.
There's another way that we can small batch it without a mixer. What is happening in that machine?
Yeah. So the thing is, you saw how kind of molassesy and caramely it looks. I'm afraid if you tried it with a bread hook or a beater, it's just going to get big and round, and that's it. Okay. Now, I can cheat. Like, I can take small batches of maple syrup. I believe it's 42 over the boiling point, cook it to sugar, drop it into a KitchenAid mixer hot, and I can make small batches of maple sugar, like a quart at a time. This is tough. The old style machines were a paddle machine. Like, so, just from the mechanical mind, a 3/4 horse motor, a right angle reduction gearbox, that thing turns extremely hard. Okay. Same thing with the old paddle type. So the old paddle type cream machines, we're getting close, ain't we? We're going to pour some cream here quick. So I'm going to pass that around on this side. So, okay. So that's what the finished product's going to really look like. Okay. What do you guys have for questions?
Adding any air in
No, no, we're really not adding any air and training any air through the process. The only time that we will get some, and I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about here maybe, is when the machine starts running out of syrup in the inside, it starts to grab some air from the top. And this is a great example of getting some air pockets or some air gaps in that cream. So once that hopper on that machine gets down toward the bottom, we start to grab some air, and like I say, then we'll see a few air pockets in that product. So I would pour it in right now. Yep. But right now I'm going to just. So that's one thing that you will find with this machine is that cream sets up pretty quick. So if you're not going to run a second batch, don't be surprised if you hear some popping and some banging happening over here. This is just hot water right now. So you'll hear kind of the popping and the banging. That cream sets up pretty quick. If you let that sit for a half an hour, there's a good chance it ain't going to move. Okay? So I learned that the hard way the first time. So with that being said, like I say, and once I make consecutive batches of cream, it seems once I have that cream made and that creaminess is kind of established, we call that seeding the machine. Once that machine is seeded with cream, that second, third, and fourth batch go a lot faster. Okay? So batch number 2, batch number 3, batch number 4 will definitely go a lot faster. So what did everybody think of the cream? All right? Okay. That's yeah. It didn't look as good the other day when I did it. Trust me, I was a little rusty. The last time I did it was the farmers market. So, okay, bud. Okay, well, we're gonna kind of wrap her up. I guess lunch will be here in just a few minutes. So.